Hello everyone and welcome to today's discussion on the lymphatic system. Today we'll only be looking at 21.1 in the Blossom. The other sections of this chapter are not material that you need to worry about. Again, just 21.1. So the lymphatic system, there is so much more to this system that we will not be discussing this semester. You will likely get a little bit more of this in physiology, and then if you take microbiology, which most of you will be, you will get a healthy dose of how the body fights off bacterial, viral, and fungal infections. So until then, the focus of today's discussion will really be getting an overview, an idea of what the lymphatic system is doing for you and me, as well as understanding the major organs, the anatomy, if you will, of the lymphatic system. We will not be looking at any specific histology, although that is scattered throughout the chapter, and we will not be looking into specific cells. And you'll see some of that scattered through this section as well, and I will guide you to minimize or omit that section. So the lymphatic system is also discussed in part in one of the cardiovascular labs, and there again you'll be learning basically the identification and location of the different lymphatic organs. So let's take a look at the lymphatic system. You may have or think of this as being the immune system, and you're not wrong. The lymphatic system is a subset of the immune system. The immune system is the totality of everything that prevents you from getting infection. And even your skin, for example, the integumentary system acts as part of your immune system because it blocks bacterial and viral and different sorts of infections from entering into your body. So the immune system is sort of a large umbrella, and then underneath that is this thing called the lymphatic system. So we're going to be focusing on that today. Some really interesting background information to sort of whet your appetite about why we care about the lymphatic system. And let's get going here. Again, the immune system is a complex of cells and organs that destroy any sort of pathogen that would come into your body, and the lymphatic system is a very large part of that. Specifically, the lymphatic system is a series of vessels, lymph vessels, lymphatic capillaries, cells, all sorts of cells. We're going to talk about different sorts of lymphocytes, but we're not going to get into the gory details of those cells, and organs like the spleen, the tonsils, the thymus, and we'll see a number of other descriptions as well, including the lymph nodes. And all of these organs are carrying essentially excess fluid and are also screening that fluid for potential infection. Lymph nodes are filtering your lymph, and during an infection that lymph node may become swollen, indicating that that lymphatic or that lymph node is fighting off an active infection. So the functions of the lymphatic system basically is to filter the blood and drain away extra body fluids. You know that there is interstitial fluid. So interstitial fluid is simply the fluid that accumulates between the cells in the tissues. So in the interstitial space, there's interstitial fluid, and this is, again, the fluid that is in between all of your cells. You are appreciating from the cardiovascular discussions and in the blood vessel conversations when we talk about capillaries, you know that plasma from the blood leaks out of the capillaries, out into the interstitial space. At that point, that fluid is called interstitial fluid. much of that interstitial fluid is reabsorbed back into the capillaries, but some of that fluid stays out in the interstitium. There are in those capillary beds, and we'll see this in a moment, lymphatic capillaries, which are then going to pick up that remaining fluid and carry it through a series of lymphatic vessels. Those vessels are going to have along their travel some lymph nodes, and those lymph nodes will contain immune cells, which are actively looking for, screening, and attempting to destroy any sort of fungal, bacterial, or viral infection. So in addition to that interstitium, or the interstitial fluid, there's also plasma, and you know that plasma is the liquidy portion of blood. So here are some numbers. In you and me, about 20 liters of plasma is released into the interstitial space of tissues every day due to the filtering that happens at the capillaries. Let me remind you, how many liters of plasma do you have in your body? Right? How many liters of plasma do you have in your body? You know that there's 4 to 6 liters of blood, and that plasma makes up roughly 50%. That's just a guess, just a roundabout average, but about 50% of your blood volume is plasma. So that means you only have 2 to 3 liters of plasma in your entire body, and yet what we're seeing here is that 20 liters of plasma are leaked into the interstitial space every day. Clearly, this is something that's happening 24/7. 24/7. You constantly have some plasma leaking into the interstitium. But of the 20 liters that are released from the blood vessels into the interstitium, about 17 liters are reabsorbed. So that means that only 3 liters are left behind. What happens to those 3 liters? Well, those 3 liters, if everything is well, get picked up by lymphatic vessels. And we're going to be seeing that there are lymphatic vessels, lymphatic trunks, lymphatic ducts. They're all part of this lymphatic network. Recall too that in diagrams, more often than not, lymphatic vessels are shown in green color. So if you see green, what looks like green blood vessels, those are not blood vessels, those are lymphatic vessels. So lymph is simply the funny name given for the fluid that is in the lymphatic system. So when you are looking at a lymphatic vessel, the fluid in there is called lymph. If you're looking at a blood vessel, the fluid in the blood vessel is called plasma. And if you're looking between cells, that fluid is called interstitial fluid. Okay, it's essentially the same fluid in different locations. Okay, so plasma, interstitial fluid, and lymph are largely the same fluid. There's a couple small differences, but for now, just imagine it's the same fluid found in different places. Now, what's that lymphatic system doing? As that fluid is picked up by the lymphatic vessels, it travels back through lymphatic organs, and in the lymphatic system there are cells that are able to detect and hopefully destroy cancer cells. They also can destroy other infections. If there is a blockage of this lymphatic flow and this flow is interrupted, it can lead to an inappropriate accumulation of fluid, which is referred to as lymphedema. Lymphedema is simply the buildup of lymph in a region of the body, which can be a sign of significant medical concern. You'll see lymphedema occur often after a person has surgery. And if that surgery interrupted any of the lymphatic vessels and interrupted the flow of lymph through those lymphatic vessels, then you may see lymphedema chronically in limbs or in regions where there has been surgery. We're going to be talking about the lymph nodes as well, and these are little bean-shaped organs located throughout the lymphatic system, and we'll see that most of those lymph nodes are focused in a few regions. We'll see that in our anatomy drawings. So let's take a look at a stereotypical picture of what the lymphatic system looks like. And you have a similar diagram in your lab manual that you have or will be learning to label. So let's take a look at the components of the lymphatic system. First, because I just mentioned it, there is between 500 and 600 lymph nodes. Now those lymph nodes, you can see them scattered throughout here. Let me make this bigger. The lymph nodes are scattered throughout. See these little jelly bean, jelly belly sized little organs, and they're all over the place, and they're found along these lymphatic vessels. These lymphatic vessels are one-way streets. So the fluid is picked up along the way from distal locations and travels more proximally. There are concentrations of lymph nodes found up in the cervical region. There are concentration of lymph nodes found in the axillary region. There are significant numbers of lymph nodes also found in the inguinal region. So those are places where there's a higher concentration, but you see them scattered throughout the body. So in addition to the lymph nodes, what else is there? Well, there's the thymus. Now, this drawing is way out of its correct sizing, if you will. The heart, you know, is about the size of your fist, and the thymus is quite large in a newborn and actually gets much smaller in an adult. So when you see an adult heart, man, the thymus is just a small little gland on the top of the heart. This is way too big to be a human thymus or an adult thymus. So this is just overdrawn for you to see it. But it is found on the superior border on the base of the heart, and you would say that the thymus is located, of course, in the mediastinum. We'll discuss what these different organs do as we go through this presentation. For now, I'm just kind of labeling or pointing out the major organs. Up in the nasopharynx and in the oropharynx, there are tonsils. You'll be seeing the adenoid as well as the palatine tonsils, and the adenoids are also called the pharyngeal tonsils. Tonsils are basically a way for the body to screen incoming air and food. So as you breathe in, the air passes by the adenoid. As you eat, the food passes by the palatine tonsils. And this is an opportunity for immune cells located within these tonsils to see, search, and hopefully destroy any sort of infection which might be trying to come into the body. There are also the spleen. Now you saw the spleen back in the digestive lab. The spleen is always introduced there in the fetal pig. You saw it associated with the stomach, but the spleen has nothing at all to do with digestion. It simply is in close proximity to the digestive organ, so it's always included. But the spleen is an important lymphatic organ, and we'll talk more about this, but the spleen filters your blood similar to what the lymph nodes are doing, but the spleen is filtering your blood looking for bacteria, viruses, cancer cells. You know that there is bone marrow, okay, not just here in the femur, but recall there's hematopoietic activity going on up in the proximal head of the femur. This is also going on in the proximal head of the humerus and a number of other flat bones in the body. And recall that inside the bone, this is where all of your blood cells are made. Those blood cells, some of those blood cells that are made are the white blood cells, which are a critical component of the lymphatic system. And so the bone marrow is considered a component of the lymphatic system. Now I hope as I say something like that, your radar is going up and you're saying, okay, that's a connection between the lymphatic system and the skeletal system. Okay, so make sure that you're thinking about those connection questions, they are no doubt going to be on this next exam. You'll want to have connections to other systems for the lymphatic system. So here is a blow up of the lymph node. We're not going to study the details of the lymph node anatomy too much, but just see that there's a one direction flow that comes into the lymph node, and the lymph node is filled with some of those lymphocytes, the white blood cells that are searching out and able to destroy potential infection. And a moment ago I talked about the 20 liters of plasma that leaks into the interstitium and the 17 liters or so that is reabsorbed. What you don't see in most blood capillary diagrams. So here we're looking at a representation of a part of a capillary bed. You see the red blood cells going through the capillary, and you know that it's in the capillary that gas exchange happens and that nutrient exchange happen. Well, notice that there's also a network of lymphatic capillaries that are associated with the blood capillaries. So when that fluid leaks out of the capillaries into the interstitial region, some of that excess fluid filters back into these lymphatic vessels, and this lymphatic fluid then travels, and there are little valves that assure that the fluid only moves in one direction through the lymphatic system. When these valves go bad, or when there's blockage of any of this flow, that's where you get the lymphedema that I mentioned. I'll point this out now, we'll see it again in a moment, but all of the lymphatic vessels head up toward the subclavian region, okay, up into the clavicle region, and you'll see that there is major dumping of the lymphatic fluid back into the vessels. We'll talk more about these trunks in a minute, or these ducts in a minute, but you'll see that the fluid that gets out into the interstitium, that gets picked up by the lymphatic vessels, after it percolates through these lymph nodes, that fluid is returned back into the blood. So that lymph becomes plasma. The moment that that fluid enters back into a blood vessel, in this case it's a vein, that fluid changes its name from lymph to plasma. So again, the indications of lymph, plasma, and interstitial fluid is largely based on where that fluid is located. So definitely learn the organs and the location identification of these lymphatic organs. One distinction, lymph is not actively pumped by the heart, okay? As you move around, yes, the fluid in the lymphatic vessels is being moved back toward the heart, but it's not being pumped as aggressively or at all like the plasma is through the blood vessels. And again, you'll see this in the diagram, but the lymphatic vessels all lead back to the lymphatic ducts located where the jugular vein and the subclavian veins come together up in the cervical region. So these lymphatic capillaries, again, picture them as very, very small vessels. They may also be called terminal lymphatics. These are one-way vessels. So whereas capillaries, you know, have incoming and outgoing flow, the lymphatic vessels pick up the fluid and it has nowhere to go but back toward the heart through the lymphatic circulation. So here is an even more detailed representation of those lymphatic capillaries associated with a capillary bed. So here's a traditional capillary bed, right? Blood is coming through an arteriole, comes through the meta-arteriole, comes into the capillary bed. You know this is where gas exchange is happening, nutrient exchange, water exchange, all that moves in and out of your bloodstream happens at the capillary bed. And then what you see is that interwoven in the capillary bed are these lymphatic capillaries. And again, excess fluid is picked up and travels back through the lymphatic vessels. The majority of the fluid will be picked back up by the blood capillaries, and join out of the capillary bed into venules. The capillaries, the lymphatic capillaries, are leaky. They're described as having endothelial flaps. Recall that blood vessels are lined by endothelial tissue. You know that's a simple squamous epithelium. And in capillaries, those cells are held together quite tightly. But in the lymphatic vessels, these endothelial cells are very loosely arranged, creating these flaps or these opportunities for fluid to enter into these sort of dead-end lymphatic capillaries. And these valves, similar to the valves that are found in veins, prevent backflow. Again, make sure you're reading through this. Now, in addition to picking up the excess interstitial fluid, another very important thing that lymphatic capillaries do, and this is limited to the small intestine. So I didn't mention this a moment ago, but your small intestine also has a very, very significant collection of lymphatic capillaries around it. And those lymphatic capillaries are referred to as the lacteals. And your lipids, the fats that you the fats that you eat, and the lipid soluble vitamins, remember this is A, D, E, and K, right? Your fat soluble vitamins, they're not able to be directly absorbed into the bloodstream. So your dietary fats and your dietary fat soluble vitamins are instead actually picked up into these lacteals, into these lymphatic vessels, to form a milky fluid called chyle. Now, in the digestive system, we saw chyme, right? Chyme was produced. That was the pasty, liquidy substance that your stomach churns everything down into before food is digested and inserted into the duodenum through the pyloric sphincter. Don't get these two words confused, right? Chyme is then this milky fluid that travels through the lymphatic system. Again, it eventually comes back to the bloodstream. So it's just interesting that fats are not directly picked up into your bloodstream, but instead first travel through the lymphatic system. These lymphatic capillaries merge into larger and larger lymphatic vessels, and then they eventually will merge all together back into the bloodstream. And we see that here. We see that on the left side. Here is what's called the thoracic duct. The thoracic duct comes up and it drains right about where the internal jugular vein comes down through the neck, and the subclavian vein returns blood from the brachial region. And right where they merge, that's where the thoracic duct drains in. That's on the left side. And then on the right side, the right lymphatic duct does a similar dumping of that fluid. Remember that while that fluid is in the lymphatic vessel, it's called lymph. Once it re-enters into the blood vessel, in this case the vein, that fluid is now referred once again to as plasma. Another interesting fact is that the lymphatic system is very asymmetric. If you'll take a look, the right lymphatic duct only drains the right arm, the right abdominal pelvic region, and the right side of the face. Whereas the left side, the thoracic duct, actually is draining the rest of the body. So both of your legs, right? Both of your legs, both essentially all of your abdominal region and your left arm, left pectoral thoracic region, and left side of the neck and head are all drained back into the left side. So again, this is another interesting example of how our body is nowhere near as symmetric as we first imagine it being. So again, we see the asymmetric distribution of the drainage, and the right lymphatic duct is only receiving from a portion of the body, whereas the rest is coming up through the thoracic duct. Note too that it's the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct. Some books may call it the left lymphatic duct, but here it's the thoracic duct. Make sure you are entertaining these questions. Now, what else is going on with the immune system? What I have given you so far is important. Everything there is very much important that you need to know. I'm going to go into just a little bit of this, and I'm not going to go into heavy information at all. But in addition to the lymphatic system, we also have other parts of our body that act as barriers to prevent infection. And one of them, of course, is your skin and your mucous membranes. And they are constantly acting as a deterrent, right, from organisms. And when I say organisms, I'm referring to fungi, to viral infections, to bacterial infections. And internally, when we talk about the lymphatic system is also able to recognize and destroy cancer cells that are forming. So definitely watch this video on what we call the non-specific defenses, and that is the skin. Again, there's nothing specific about viruses or bacteria, but non-specifically the skin acts as an important barrier. Also, though, you have what's called the adaptive immune response. And this is where we get into all the different cells. This is why you get immunizations, right? Where you get vaccines, because your immune response can adapt to those incoming signals. We're not going to go into that conversation, okay? But just know that these adaptive immune responses are the lymphocytes. That makes sense, right? The cells of the lymphatic organs. So the lymphocytes are, there's a whole bunch of them, but they are different types of white blood cells that are really a devoted part of the lymphatic system. Remember that all of the cells in your blood, and all, including all these lymphocytes, are all first made in your bone marrow, right? All blood cells, including the lymphocytes, are first made in the bone marrow. And then we'll see that there's a slightly different pathway of how they are released and where they're stored in the body. Now you're going to see a little bit of this information also presented in the blood presentation about the differentiation or the formation of different white blood cells. Just like there, we're not going to go into the nitty-gritty. We're just going to overall appreciate that the lymphocytes are formed from the lymphoid side of this chart. So let's take a look at that. There's a number of different cells here. Again, we're not going to go into the nitty-gritty, but there are some cells that are phagocytic, right? They can chew up and destroy. Those lymphocytes we're going to see are hugely important in activities involved with your adaptive immunity, antibodies and immune responses. And then there are other cells that literally spew out chemicals to destroy, for example, bacteria. And I talked about neutrophils in the blood chapter. So neutrophils are specifically designed to spew out chemicals. They literally release bleach that destroys bacteria. Other cells, like the eosinophils, are specifically designed to fight off parasites. And other cells are specifically designed to fight off viruses. So you've seen a similar chart to this, and just remember that all of your blood cells start out in the bone marrow by this hemopoietic stem cell, or this hemocytoblast. And the hemocytoblast can go into two directions, right? It can go myeloid or lymphoid. For today's conversation, we're only worried about the lymphoid side. And from the lymphoid side, we make the different types of lymphocytes. That's all. That's all we need to worry about. So the cells of the lymphatic system are all lymphoid stem cells, are made from those lymphoid stem cells. So the natural killer cells, the T cells, the B cells, and the plasma cells all are derived over here. All of the rest of your blood cells are derived from this side of the equation, of the chart, and this is your myeloid side. And this is where you're going to get, let's review this. This is where you're going to get your platelets, which are little blebs from your megakaryocytes. This is where you're going to get your erythrocytes, your red blood cells, and all of the other white blood cells, including basophils, neutrophils, eosinophils, and monocytes, which many of them become macrophages. So this is where I'm going to get really vague, okay, because it's not something you need to know when it comes to these different cells. There's a couple of facts that I do want you to know, but much of this is more detail than I want you to be responsible for. So again, those lymphocytes are the primary cells of your adaptive immune response. All that means is this is the complex system by which you make antibodies and you fight off infection through specific cells of the lymphatic system. Of these cells, here's what I want you to know. There's a lot of them, right? You have about 10 to the 12th power of lymphocytes in the body. Most of them, some of them are floating around in the bloodstream. Some of them are floating around in the lymph, but many of these cells are hanging out in your spleen and in your lymph node. So we're going to see that these cells are floating around, and many of them are taking up residency in these lymphatic organs. I also mentioned the thymus. So once those cells are made in the bone marrow, the B cells, the B lymphocytes, mature in the bone marrow, and there's why they're called the B cells. But then the T cells, they actually leave the bone marrow, they go to the thymus. Remember, the thymus was that small organ on the superior border of the heart, and it's there that the T cells mature. So the T cells, thymus, the B cells, you can think of B standing for the bone marrow. So what do I want you to know? This is what I want you to know, and this is it. I want you to know that B cells make antibodies. B cells make antibodies. There's a B right there in antibodies. So B cells make antibodies. That's really what I want you to know. So what is an antibody? An antibody is basically a group of proteins that are specifically designed to fight off an antigen. What is an antigen? An antigen is basically anything in your body. When it comes to your immune system, you only want your immune system to seek out and destroy foreign antigens. You'll hear this again, but foreign antigens are anything that enters your body that is not typically there, right? So if you have a bacterial or a viral or a fungal infection, your body recognizes those foreign antigens as potentially harmful. And your body hopefully has antibodies that can seek out and destroy those foreign antigens. You do not want your body to produce antibodies that fight off your normal functioning parts of your body. If you have an immune response against your own body parts, that's referred to as an autoimmune disease. So when your own immune system is fighting, destroying a part of your own body, that's an autoimmune disease. And there's a whole bunch of autoimmune diseases. For example, MS. right? MS is an autoimmune disease, essentially, where the body is breaking down the myelin found in the nervous system. So that's what I want you to know. B cells make antibodies. T cells, they do not make antibodies, but they do a number of other functions, and there's a whole host of T cells, right? There's all sorts of them, and we are absolutely not going to go into all of that. What I will tell you is that you can't tell a T cell from a B cell by looking at it. Okay, you cannot tell these cells apart. They just have very different roles. Also, there are plasma cells. I'm not going to worry about the plasma cells. They are basically specialized B cells, right? They're specialized B cells. You may hear of them, but we're not going to worry about plasma cells. And we're also not going to worry about natural killer cells, although they're really cool. And they are, got a great name, right? Natural killer cells. But they are very important in killing off cells that are deemed toxic or not toxic, but foreign or potentially damaging to you. And natural killer cells can also wipe out some cancer cells that may be forming in your body. So in this chart, right, B cells generate antibodies. T cells secrete all sorts of chemical signals that are part of your immune system. Plasma cells and NK cells. Plasma cells, I remember I told you, are a specialized type of B cell, so they also are releasing antibodies. And NK cells are all about destroying cells, specifically virally infected cells. So when a virus enters your body and the virus attacks the cell, your cell sends out an SOS signal, basically. And that SOS signal is picked up by the NK cell. And the NK cell comes and tries to destroy that virally infected cell, which of course limits the ability of the virus to spread in your body. So, not much about the cells. Now let me just share with you a little bit about the lymphatic organs, or the lymphoid organs. A couple of these are considered primary lymphoid organs. And the reason, well, the two primary lymphoid organs are the bone marrow and the thymus gland. Those are the two. And we'll see that this is where these are formed and or matured, okay? So all of them start in the bone marrow, and the T cells go to the thymus gland to mature. So these are your primary lymphoid organs. You already know a little bit about this, right? That in the bone marrow, that's where hematopoiesis occurs. So we have hematopoiesis, the formation of all blood cell formation. And again, the B cells are developing in the bone marrow. The T cells leave as an immature cell. They travel over to the thymus, and that's where they kind of grow up and mature. Here's a cut through the head of the femur, and you can see they've cut off the top, and you can see this spongy bone, and you can even see the very beginning of the medullary cavity. So you can see that yellow bone marrow that would then travel down through the diaphysis of the bone. The thymus is the other primary lymphoid organ, and like I said, it's found up between the sternum and the aorta, very small in you and me. Okay, so much, much smaller than this honking thymus that is shown here. Don't worry about the histology. Don't worry about any of the other details here about the thymus. Really what I want you to know is just recognize that the thymus is a primary lymphoid organ, and that it's found on the surface of the heart, and that it's the place where T cells mature. The rest of the lymphoid organs are referred to as secondary because the cells end up going there after they're formed. And the secondary lymphoid organs include the lymph nodes. The lymph nodes. Again, 500 to 600 of them. And lymph nodes you can think of as basically being little filters. They are filtering the lymph as it passes through the lymphatic vessels. Don't worry about the histology at all. But there are afferent vessels, right, that bring the lymph into the lymph node. Within the lymph node, there are a bunch of T cells, right, that are there to, and other lymphocytes that are there to screen and check out what might be coming through the lymph. And then there's a one-way outflow through the efferent side. So there's an afferent side and an efferent side. All sorts of lymph nodes, again, all over the body. Spleen. The spleen is also a major secondary lymphoid organ. Its role, though, is not to screen the lymph. It is screening the blood. So the spleen is a relatively fragile organ. It doesn't have a real good outside capsule. So we say that it is friable. Friable just means that it's very, very fragile. And so the spleen is very open to damage. But as the spleen is filtering the blood, so the spleen, right, filters the blood, does the same job as the lymph nodes. It's looking for, right, in the spleen there are lots of macrophages and lots of other cells, and the spleen is sort of a recycling center. Not only is it screening for potential infection, but it's also, recall, taking in dying red blood cells, and also is looking constantly for those blood-borne pathogens. So lots of blood goes through the splenic artery to the spleen and then returns out through the splenic vein back to the inferior vena cava. Don't worry about the histology, but just know that there are lots and lots of immune cells sitting in the spleen waiting for the opportunity to trounce on an infection, some sort of bacterial or viral infection. A couple other structures, the tonsils, and there are 3 of them essentially up in the nasopharynx behind the nasal passages. There is the adenoid, otherwise known as the pharyngeal tonsils. The tonsils that most of you think about, there are 2 of them left and right. They are the Palatine Tonsils. They're found essentially along your soft palate. And then there's also some lingual tonsils. Some lingual tonsils, and they're under or associated with the tongue, the back of the tongue. But when you hear about tonsils, what you're normally referring to are the Palatine tonsils. If a child has their tonsils removed, it is almost always these Palatine tonsils. There's the uvula hanging down. So you say ah, right? The uvula is hanging down and the tongue here is stuck out, and you can see the Palatine tonsils. Now here they're inflamed a little bit, but in you and me we wouldn't see that. But if there was infection, you say ah, and what is the doctor looking at? When the doctor is looking in your mouth, they're looking to see if there's signs of infection because the tonsils are swollen. How do the tonsils do their work? I'll just say this. The outside capsule of the tonsils is an discontinuous capsule. There are little holes, basically, in the outer capsule around the tonsil. So as you breathe in air and as you eat food, some of those particles are able to penetrate into the tonsil and be checked out, right, for the presence of bacteria, viruses, or fungi. And again, within the lymph node, or within the tonsil, sorry, there are lymphocytes, and those lymphocytes, if they do detect an infection, those lymphocytes will go to battle. They will make more of themselves. They'll basically generate an army of white blood cells, and that will cause a swelling and oftentimes discomfort of that organ. You can see here, right, how swollen the Palatine tonsils are. Make this a little bit larger, but you can see just how swollen they are compared to the normal picture we saw a moment ago. Then along the gut, I told you there were lymph nodes in your intestines, but in your intestines, it's referred to instead as MALT, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. This is basically, you can think of it kind of as little lymph nodes that are lining your intestines, right? These little lymph nodes are called the Pyre Patches. The Pyre Patches are a type of this MALT. And basically, as you consume food, right, doesn't it make sense that along your intestines, there would be immune cells waiting to detect and destroy bacteria and other things that could be harmful to you. So it makes good sense, right, that we have a lot of lymphatic activity along the intestine. Here is actually the lumen of the small intestine, and right along the edge, you can see these Pyre Patches, these patches of lymphatic tissue. There's similar MALT-like tissue in the bronchus, in the airways, except there it's called bulked, right? Bulked, because it's in the bronchial tree. Same idea as you're breathing in air. That air is carrying in potentially bacteria and viruses, so your lungs are highly lymphatic, right? There's a lot of bulked and MALT, and guys, there's two connections, right? Lymphatic connected to the digestive system through MALT, the lymphatic tied to the respiratory system through BALT. And that brings us to the end of what is you're responsible for the lymphatic system. And as I go down here, it looks like you should be able to answer all of those questions. And don't forget to check out the vocabulary checkup here at the end of 21.1.